Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, and as I say at the start of each episode, I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Now, what are we going to talk about on today's episode? We're going to talk about the fact that taking care of today's fuel involves more things than it used to. Now, in the past, when we talked about this subject, we talked about how proper stored fuel care involves what I would call a hybrid approach to it. Three essential things instead of just one solution that's shoehorned into every fuel situation. Now, something that relates to all three of those essential parts of that hybrid approach, to all three of those things, is tank sampling. Taking samples of your stored fuel. Why? Why is it so important? Well, for starters, if you're taking proper care of stored fuel, then one of the things you're supposed to do on a regular basis is check the condition of your fuel. That means you have to get a sample of it from the tank in order to be able to do that. I mean, you can't exactly take the top off your storage tank and look down inside and see everything that you need to see. No, you have to take a sample from that tank, and then you examine that sample. So tank sampling is an essential part of the practice of good fuel maintenance. And that's because tank sampling is the only thing that enables you to find out what you need to know about your fuel's condition. Knowing your fuel's condition is essential to being able to make good decisions about what to do next, which in fairness could be nothing. Not all stored fuel needs something done to it. Your stored fuel could be perfectly healthy, in great condition, ready to go in an emergency. But you won't know that for sure unless you check its condition. That necessarily means doing tank sampling of that fuel. So why do we tank sample? We do it to look at the condition of our fuel, and we do it to get fuel and water samples with which to do testing that would give us the benefit of a defined problem and solution if applicable. But we do have to recognize that not all sampling is created equal. Specifically, it is really important that you take a fuel sample from the right place in the fuel in that tank. If you make the mistake of not realizing you have to do this, then you can set yourself up for failure, because the sample that you get, it's either number one, not going to contain the things that are actually there in your tank, and that would indicate that you do have a problem that needs action if you saw them. In other words, it's not going to be representative of what's actually in your tank. Or another way it could be non-representative, so to speak, is your sample might end up containing too much of certain things that actually are there. But your sample captures a disproportionate amount of them, and that gives you a false picture of the condition of your fuel, might even cause you to go down the wrong path when it comes to treatment. So to understand this idea about the fact that it's really important you take a sample in the right place in that tank, to understand that more fully, we talk about the idea that a fuel tank or a fuel system is not a homogeneous representation. In other words, what we're saying is, depending on where in that tank, up, down, here, depending on where in that tank or system you are, it could look different. The fuel could look different. The conditions could look different in different areas of the same tank. We also talk about where you sample in terms of the location within that tank can set your testing up for success or failure. And when we say that it's important where we sample, we're talking about the depth of the sample, not horizontally where. So we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. And we're also going to talk about a little later on, talk about the differences in what you might see if you were to sample fuel from the top of the tank, the middle of the tank, or let's say 18 inches or 3 inches from the bottom, or even the very bottom of the tank. What kind of differences might you expect to see in fuel that came from those very different places in the same tank? You're likely to see very different kinds of fuel between these locations. So let's talk about those things. Let's dive in here. So Sampling of the fuel in your tank is important because it ends up being the snapshot representation of your fuel supply. In other words, if you take that sample and you're going to use that sample to you're going to do a fuel test on that sample. The test results that you get, typically, the reason you're doing it is because you're trying to find out there's a problem in there. And so you're going to look at those test results, and those test results are going to be the determiner of what conclusions you draw about the fuel in that tank, and then what action you need to take. Okay? But if you think about it, the test results that you're getting back from that test, those actually, strictly speaking, only apply to that little bit of sample fuel or even subsample. That means a sample of the sample. Really only applies to that sample or that subsample that you actually tested. If you want to be most accurate, those test results are only true of the fuel sample that the test was actually run on. But in this industry, we tend to want to apply the conclusions inferred by those test results. We want to apply those to the entire body of fuel in the whole system. And so the extent to which you can do that really depends on the extent to which your sample is actually representative of that entire body of fuel. So, having said that, having established that, let's talk about two important things: how you sample and where you should sample from. So, how you should sample. The best thing to use for getting fuel samples from a storage tank is something called a fuel sampler. Colloquially, some might call it a bacon bomb. For those that are watching on video, this is what a bacon bomb looks like. Bacon bomb, more correctly, we would call it a fuel sampler, because bacon bomb can be kind of awkward if you're doing traveling and you were to have this in your luggage and the TSA agent pulls this out and says, "Sir, ma'am, what is this?" And you say, "Oh, that's just a bacon bomb." Okay, that could be a little bit awkward. So these kind of fuel samplers, they look like long metallic cylinders, and they're really made to be devices that you can get a liquid sample from at whatever depth of the tank you need to get it at. So they tend to be made of non-sparking metal for safety, typically brass or aluminum, not stainless steel. And they will typically have a couple of lines attached to them, maybe like braided nylon cord. And that's so that you can take, or even a chain. And that's typically so that you can use those to lower them down into the tank to whatever depth you need to take it from. Once you're at that desired depth, then you would use the other line essentially to trigger the opening, to open the opening in the bottom of the sampler. And so once that opens, the surrounding liquid then rushes in, goes up into the sampler, and fills it up. And then once you close it, then you can pull that back out. And now you have a liquid sample collected from the inside of your tank at whatever depth you had the sampler at. Now, as you might expect, these kind of fuel samplers, they'll come in different volume sizes. They can be 4 ounces, they can be 8 ounces, they can even be higher. Of course, the larger they are, the more expensive they are. Just depends on what you need. So you pull the sample from your desired height or depth, you pull it out, then you open the sample, you decant it into a sample holding container. Then if you need to, you can lower it back down in there and take another sample, depending on if you need a larger volume or not. So bottom line is, if you manage stored fuel and you're taking care of it, a fuel sampler, a bacon bomb, if you will, you definitely want to have one of those as part of your essential fuel maintenance toolkit. So that's how you take a sample. Now, the second question, remember, was where should you sample from? Now, recall that you're taking the sample. The reason you're taking the sample is because you want to have a representative picture of the fuel in your tank, because you're going to make observations about it from it, or you're going to do testing on that. and the result of that testing is going to tell you something important about that sample's condition or properties, and thus the conditional properties of the fuel in that tank. If the sample's representative enough, you're going to assume that whatever's true about the conditions or properties of that sample are representative of the conditions and properties of the tank fuel in general. So with that in mind, there are a couple of principles that we want to keep in mind regarding this concept that fuel sampling is supposed to give us a picture of what our fuel looks like. So principle number one is it is actually useful to sample from multiple places in the tank to get a representative picture of what the fuel is. You can do that. You're not just limited to taking one sample from one place and then stopping and saying that's it. You can do anything like that you want. And sometimes what people will do is sample from multiple places, let's say multiple depths, and they'll aggregate it. And then they'll use that to draw conclusions about the, shall we say, general conditions. Okay, so that's principle number one. Principle number two is the place. And in other words, remember, place means height or depth. The depth that you sample in the tank matters because different areas or different depths of the tank will give you different representations of what the fuel is like. Now, the best place to sample from, that's the question that should be coming out of it as you're listening to this. What is the best place for me to sample from? Well, the best place to sample from really depends on what you need to find out, what kind of testing you need to do on the sample. For example, are you testing to determine how much water and sediment are in your fuel? Are you going to test for detecting microbial contamination? Are you verifying your fuel cetane rating? For any of these and others, it matters where in the tank you pull your sample from. Now, where is important because, like we said before, one thing you don't want to get is, or one situation you don't want to have is, you don't want to pull a fuel sample out of your tank that's full of things that will skew your results. We alluded to this earlier. If you sample from the wrong place, this can happen. Now this, if you don't know about it, this can be an elementary mistake that's easy to make. If you don't know that where you sample from does make a difference. So when we talk about places to sample from, again, talking about the depth of the tank, not the width. Reason we don't talk about the width is that fuel does not tend to change condition that much moving laterally in a tank as much as it does change horizontally. That is why the ASTM guidelines for fuel sampling and handling, they talk about or they give recommendations on what height to sample from, but they don't typically talk that much about a lateral difference. Of course, another big reason practically is that tanks tend to be designed with limited places laterally to draw samples. So you got a lot less flexibility in that regard. So what are some of the common places that you can sample from in the tank, and what are the pros and cons of sampling from those places? So let's start at the top. Talk about sampling from the top of the tank. Now, for tanks that don't, let's say, have a bottom dispenser, this is actually the most common place for people to pull a sample from, is from the top fuel, because it's the easiest place to reach. The fuel at the top of the tank, it tends to be the cleanest and tends to be in the best condition. And that's because the things that tend to be associated with poor fuel condition, like water, sediment, microbial presence, those tend to be concentrated further down, more towards the bottom of the tank. Water tends to be at the bottom because free water is heavier than fuel, so it will automatically find its way down to the bottom of the tank. Microbes tend to like to live near where that water is, and so microbes will tend to want to grow and live at the interface. Again, that's going to be in the bottom part of the tank. And tank sediment whether it's gums, varnishes, sludge, fallout, asphaltenes, all that kind of stuff tends to sink down to the bottom. So all of the bad stuff tends to be concentrated down at the bottom. And that means that the fuel up at the top tends to be the cleanest, tends to be in the best condition. Now, that fact influences whether you should take a sample from that area. And that really depends on what you're trying to find out. So, taking a sample from the top would be okay if you're doing a test that wasn't influenced by water, wasn't influenced by microbes, or wasn't influenced by sediment. Things like, let's say, thinking through ASTM tests, lubricity, copper strip corrosion. You could do some of the combustion tests like flashpoint distillation. You could use fuel from the top. Now, that being said, there's a caveat here. You could, let's say you needed to do a distillation. You could pull a sample from the top and have a distillation run, and that might be okay. However, that doesn't mean you have to do it from the top. The reason why you may, even though you can, you may not necessarily want to run a distillation or a combustion test from on shall we say top fuel is because if there is any difference in condition between the fuel at the top and the fuel at, let's say, the middle, or 18 inches from the bottom, you will, if you're testing for combustion properties, you probably do want to get a picture of what the worst case scenario is. And so that means you probably wouldn't want to just test the fuel at the top. You probably would want to take fuel further down, because you don't want the best case. You want to document the worst case scenario in case it's bad enough that you need to do something about it. Now, top tests, fuel at the top, taking a sample of that, running tests, that's bad for if you're trying to determine water and sediment content, if you're trying to determine microbial content, because as we said a minute ago, you're not going to find those things up at the top. They're all down at the bottom. And so if you take a sample from the top and you run a microbial test, or you run a water and sediment test, there's no water and sediment up at the top. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get a false negative reading. And so then that means that you're probably not going to take action when you might actually need to take action. So we would not recommend using top samples for anything measuring contaminants of that fuel, like water and sediment, microbes. And when push came to shove, I myself probably would not use a top sample to test combustion properties. Okay, what about the middle of the tank? How do you take a sample from the middle of the tank? Well, this is where having a tank sampler that has a cord on it comes in handy, because what you can do, you can estimate the depth of the fuel in that tank. Then you can lower the fuel sampler until it reaches the bottom, and then you would take your cord and you would note where on the cord that was, and then you would pull it back up, and then you would take whatever length of cord it took to reach from the top of the fuel down to the bottom, and then you would mark off half of that depth. And then you would lower it down until that half depth mark reached the opening, and then you would know that your sampler is halfway in the middle of that fuel. You could take your sample. So what are middle fuel samples good for? Well, middle samples are really similar to top samples. So the fuel is going to have some of the same pros, and it's going to have some of the same cons. It's going to be pretty similar to that. You could use middle sample fuel for tests not involving water and sediment or microbial or gross contamination detection. You could use it for that. But as with the top, the cons are also true. As with top fuel, you don't want to test middle fuel for microbes or water or sediment or gross contaminants, because again, those won't tend to be in the middle. They're going to be a little further down. Okay, so top and middle are pretty similar. What about 18 inches from the bottom? I believe ASTM refers to 18 inches from the bottom as typically the bottom middle is what they call it. So bottom middle samples, about 18 inches from the bottom of the tank, is the recommended place to take samples that aren't coming from the very bottom. 18 inches from the bottom is probably the best place to do a water and sediment test. And when I say water and sediment, I mean an ASTM water and sediment test, the one that's in D975. It's probably the best place to take fuel if you're going to run that kind of test, because you're less likely to get a true-false positive or a true-false negative. If there's water and sediment, it's very likely going to be representative around that 18-inch mark. And if one thing's for certain, you want your sample, wherever you take it from, to be representative of what's going on in there. 18 inches from the bottom is also good for stability testing. It's also good for any kind of combustion test because, again, fuel's close enough in depth to where the pickup typically is that the combustion properties of that fuel are going to be more representative of the combustion properties of what the customer is going to get when they dispense that fuel. So 18 inches from the bottom, what we call bottom middle, those are good for water and sediment, ASTM water and sediment, good for stability, and good for combustion tests. Now, what are they not so good for? Well, they're not so good for microbial, and that is because microbes are still more likely to be located further down. Remember, we said microbes will tend to aggregate them or concentrate themselves near that fuel-water interface. Most tanks will have a free water phase that may be 1 inch, 2 inches, maybe 3 inches. So that interface is going to be, if you're pulling a sample at 18 inches down, the microbes are probably going to be more than 1 foot away from that. And so you're not likely to capture the microbes needed for it to be representative of your situation. So that's bottom middle, 18 inches. What about 3 inches from the bottom? 3 inches from the bottom is about where you want to take your bottom samples. When somebody says get a sample from the bottom, they don't mean get it from the dead bottom, the absolute bottom. They mean about 3 inches from the bottom. So 3 inches from the bottom is where you want to take bottom fuel samples from. And there are some clear pros and cons as to what you could use this sample for. 3-inch samples are good for microbial tests because, like we were just saying a minute ago, about 3 inches is a good ballpark area for where you're most likely to capture fuel that's representative of your microbial situation. 3 inches is about where the most microbial contamination is likely to be at because it's going to be closest to the fuel-water interface. So you're most likely to get some of that interface in the sample, along with some of the fuel, and then also some of the microbially created fuel-water emulsion that tends to be stratified above and below that fuel-water interface. So a 3-inch bottom sample is most likely to give you a representative picture of the microbial situation in your tank. Now, what do you not want to use a 3-inch sample for? Well, you don't want to use this kind of sample for any tests measuring water and sediment because the water and sediment are going to be concentrated in that area. Now, because of the way that a Bacon Bomb fuel sampler takes samples, if you lower that sampler down in there, down to 3 inches, you're right by the fuel-water interface, right? You open it up, all that stuff rushes into the sampler. What you're going to end up happening is you're actually going to end up getting a disproportionate amount of water and sediment up into that sampler. When you decant that, you pull it out, you decant that into a sample jar, you might end up with a sample that's half water and half fuel. Now, if somebody didn't know where you pulled that from, they would look at that and they would say, well, gee, you got a storage tank that's half full of water. Well, no, that's not representative of what's actually in your tank because it pulled a disproportionate amount of what was immediately near it. It pulled a disproportionate amount of that up into the sampler. So taking a sample at a location of about 3 inches probably puts that sampler right next to the water phase. And so again, half your sample could end up being water. And so if you have that tested and You do like a Carl Fisher or something, testing laboratories don't tend to distinguish between those things. They test what you give them. So they're just going to test the contents of in there, and the contents of that sample. And then they're going to give you a test result back that says, oh, you got 50% water. Well, no, you don't actually have 50% water. It's just that the sample that you got from 3 inches from the bottom wasn't actually representative of the water content that's in your tank. It just happened to get pulled from everything that was around that bacon bomb at that location. So, in summary, top and middle samples are not going to be of that much use in the grand scheme of things because they're too clean. Samples from bottom middle, or what we call 18 inches from the bottom, are good for almost every kind of fuel test except for ones trying to capture microbial content. Samples 3 inches from the bottom are really good for capturing microbial content, but you don't want to use them for any tests that are measuring the, shall we say, the percent content of water and sediment or those kind of related tests. So, summary, if you're doing, let's say, mission critical testing, that tends to involve different kinds of tests listed on D975, may also involve microbial testing. Like, let's say you're doing a good ATP test. If you're doing that kind of mission critical testing, where do you want to take your samples from? You typically want to take 2 samples. You want to take one from 3 inches from the bottom, and you want to take one from about 18 inches from the bottom. You don't want to worry about taking samples from the top or the middle because they're not really going to tell you anything useful about what's going on. So if you intend to take these 2 samples, what order should you do them in? Well, what you want to do is you want to take the higher sample first. So you lower your bacon bomb down to about 18 inches. You take that sample, you pull it out. So what you're supposed to do then is you're supposed to clean out your sampler. The ASTM guidelines would tell you to do that. If you're not doing anything that's microbially sensitive, you've got a little bit more leeway for that. But if you're testing for microbes and you're being rigorous about it, then you would definitely want to clean it out before you took the second sample. One thing you would not want to do is if you're trying to test for microbes, some people make the mistake of taking the lower sample first. So they lower it down 3 inches from the bottom, they take the sample, they put it out, and then they may not clean their sampler. Well, now your sampler has got all that microbial stuff has been inside of it. And so if you then immediately take it and you take a higher sample, what's going to happen to that higher sample? It's going to get contaminated by the microbes that were down at the bottom. And what that's going to usually end up giving you is an inaccurate microbial content test on your higher sample. So to be safe, take the higher sample first, then take your lower sample. And as always, you want to follow the recommended protocols for sample handling. That means at a minimum, use, clean sample containers. Don't use your jam jar that you had your strawberry jam in last night. Use clean sample containers. And very importantly, once you've pulled those, you want to seal them up and you want to get them on ice after you've taken them. That will slow any microbial changes. And then you want to test those as soon as possible after they've been drawn. So that, my friends, is a summary of the considerations for where you want to sample from in your fuel tank, especially considering what kinds of things you might need to find out and which locations in your tank are best for getting samples for doing that. So that is all for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. As always, you can find information on everything we talked about in the show notes. If you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe to this podcast at your favorite podcast platform. Leave us a rating if you haven't done so already, because it does really help people find us. So again, thank you for joining us for today's episode. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. I will see you next time on the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.